Hi, it's Nicole, and today I want to talk about reading in another language. Since starting reading French in the summer of 2017, I've read 29 books in that language. This includes novels, nonfiction, children's books, comics, and even a play. And those books have covered a wide range of genres and categories like classics, contemporary, feminism, politics, humor, and so on. But for some context, I grew up in a monolingual household, and I would say that, like everyone else that I grew up with, the 6 and a bit years of compulsory second language learning classes in high school did nothing really to help with my ability to function well in the language. And even though I actually did a 2-year associate's degree in French language, I was still pretty much non-functional in that language until really 2017, I would say. All that said, I think it is important to get some of that background context on my particular language learning journey, because although I was non-functional, I did have that background of language sort of being around, I guess, or encouraged. That was all a period of learning bits of very, very basic, very, very common vocabulary and grammar, but all of that stuff I think can be done very quickly on one's own. So I kind of do dismiss that as any sort of leg up. And despite the fact that I am an English speaker who learned French, and those languages are relatively close, I am hoping that this video is useful whether or not you're learning Arabic from knowing Korean or any other language like that, because I think the techniques and the ways of thinking about things are overall still going to be largely the same. And I won't be mentioning any specific tools in this video because I think the techniques and concepts are more important than the specific tools, which I think will change depending on just your personal preferences and tastes. So before we begin with the actual main points that I had, the first two things I would say is, if your language that you're learning is a very different script than your native language, obviously you need to be very, 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 very comfortable with recognizing the script of your target language. And the other thing I would say is to set your expectations ridiculously low. And I think that this is really underappreciated, especially among regular readers who are like, yeah, but I read like 50 books in like 2 months. So obviously, even if reading in my second language is going to be slower, I could probably read like 20 books by the end of the year. Like, okay, maybe, but that's not me. So I'm going to be giving some tips that I think are a little bit more applicable to the vast majority of us who aren't like elite Mensa level geniuses. This one is going to seem maybe a little condescending even, but it really helped me. And I don't know why it didn't click for me as being super obvious when I first started, but at the very beginning, identifying the function that each word has in a sentence, even if you don't know what the word means, kind of having an idea of what its function is likely to be in the sentence is so vital to the whole process. And I guess because I was coming from being completely monolingual, that's just when you are reading a language or interacting with your language, you don't think about these things pretty much at all. You learn how to use nouns and prepositions and adjectives and adverbs naturally, and then you learn about them in a boring class in school. I didn't think it was boring, but you know, you learn about them in English language, and it's kind of not that important, I feel, other than if you're actually going to then associate that with another language, largely, or like be an English language teacher or something, I guess. I mean, yeah. For me, whenever I had to try in an exam or an assignment to read something in my target language, it just felt like a bunch of words that I could like sound out and maybe understand what they might mean individually, but putting it together in a sentence just did not compute. And I think it was because I was approaching it as reading each word separately without any idea of how they function, like what their purpose was. So it really helped me to situate myself in the sea of gobbledygook by realizing, oh, okay, I need a noun somewhere here to be doing the thing, and then what verb is acting on it, and like being very mechanical about my approach was super helpful for me. Maybe that, again, seems either condescending or super basic, but I am trying to give tips based on what I would have needed to go from a non-functional person who had spent a lot of time around my language but still unable to really break through to properly engage with it, to now being able to function with it. Using ebooks is a very, very common tip for learning to read in your second language, because obviously all of the tools like the dictionaries and online is right at your fingertips, and it is really helpful. I do try to make sure that when I am using the dictionary, I'm using the French dictionary rather than a French to English translator and dictionary, if possible, so I get that understanding of the word that I'm unsure about, but it's still within the whole context of French. It hasn't pulled me back out of the language that I'm trying to get deeper into by pulling me into this familiar English language world every few pages. But I also think it's really overhyped, the idea that you have to be completely submerged into your target language. So if you want to look up a word in your native language and that's just faster and helps you to keep going and you can just jump back in and it flows, I think do that. I don't think that we should be putting unnecessary barriers in the way to make all of this more difficult than it already is, because it's already a task, you know? And the point is trying to get that access to the language and get access to that story that you're reading, or that or access to that information that you're trying to get out of this book. And something that I like to do if my e-reader has multiple highlight colors is have one color for things that I would just generally want to highlight and remember anyway, no matter what the language is that I'm reading in, just an interesting quote or information from the book that I've understood and liked, and have another color to identify new words that I want to remember even if I never go back to them. I think there's something that helps me to just highlight it, and then by doing that, I think if I am ever going to go back through my pages or whatever, or just even noticing how often I'm doing that, it's kind of encouraging to see when the regularity with which I have to do that becomes less. So we all know the struggle of trying to find appropriate reading material, both for our level but also for our interests. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of material that is specifically made for learners can be pretty boring, and the topics are just not always relevant to your interests. But on the flip side of that, native speaker material can feel really daunting and just a completely other league. And of course there are lots of lists that will separate reading material into the CEFR reading levels, so A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, with the C's being the most native level, most difficult to access, I guess, the A's being quite basic and simple. And I do think that these lists can be very helpful. They tend to be full of a lot of classics and children's books, or the recommendation will be to read something that you've already read several times, preferably in your native language, and loved. And many people take that to mean Harry Potter and pick that up and blah blah blah. Personally, I feel like there's some big issues with all of those. With classics, I think there's a huge issue of antiquated language, and in French there are some tenses that are only used in this kind of historical storytelling style, and we don't really see that so much now in contemporary writing anyway, so that kind of feels a little, unless like reading French classics specifically is your thing that you want to do, I don't find that necessarily that helpful for learning to read more generally in your target language. And for reading a book like Harry Potter, I feel like the counter argument to that is that you're reading a book that, any high fantasy book, you are reading something that has a lot of made up words that are going to be, I don't know, maybe that's fun if you're a super fan of the series, but I think a lot of that language won't actually be that useful, but you're using up a lot of your time to learn this language that isn't that transferable to other things and other books. So that's not really the route at this point at the beginning of getting into learning to read in another language. That's not really the route that I prefer to take. And as for kids books, I freaking love kids books, but I'm very aware that a lot of other people don't. And so what do you do if none of the content that is at your level is actually interesting to you? So as I said, I love kids books and I also love comics, and I think those are some really great ways to jump into your second language, especially for me, French, because they have a huge graphic novel scene, and it's just totally my jam. But I understand that that's not for everyone, and like I said, a lot of the language in classics can be antiquated, and a lot of it can feel kind of dry anyway, no matter what language you're reading in. I mean, I like classics too, but you know, it's not for everyone. So what do you do at that point? I would say looking for modern classics, because the language is going to be a little less antiquated, but still probably simple, and I think that whole category covers a wide range of topics still, and I think is close enough in time that it feels relevant as well. And then there are popular contemporary authors, and I think this is a really good one. At least for me, I found this really good. The author that I jumped in with when I got better at reading in French was Amélie Nothomb, but the first book that I ever read cover to cover in French was L'étranger by Albert Camus, and I loved it. I really loved it, and I think part of why I loved it was probably because it was the first book that I'd read cover to cover in French, but I also just liked the content and I found it really accessible, and that's a modern classic. And the last tip thing I guess I would recommend is trying to read some nonfiction. I know that nonfiction can feel really intimidating or boring for a lot of people, but I think the language in nonfiction tends to be less flowery and super like emotional descriptions and that kind of thing, and it tends to be a lot more straightforward. Not always, but tends to be. I think especially when you're doing something like reading the news, that's something that you can dip in and out of in little bites, and a lot of the time there are websites that will kind of distill the things that have happened into little bite-sized chunks of news, and other countries have those kinds of news bites accessible as well. I know there are loads of those kinds of things available for French, and I'm sure that other languages have the same. I think a lot of people do overlook this because they think that they can only read the news, for example, but I mean, you could also just trawl social media for the same content that you would look at in your native language and see if you can find people and organizations on social media that are doing that in your target language, because that's going to be bite-sized chunks of language that you can just dip in and out of. And on most social media sites there is a quick little translation thing, so you can go back and forth between the language that you're trying to learn and English if you ever get stuck on any of the words or sentence constructions or anything like that. I think it's a real shame that nonfiction tends to get overlooked when people are thinking about reading in their target language, and it's even more of a shame that when people do jump into nonfiction, they restrict it only to things like reading bits about the news. And I do, again, I think that's a really good starting point, because the news in general, we kind of already have a base idea of what's happening in the world, most likely to some extent, and so when they're talking about stuff in your target language, it's, I think, a little easier to pick up on the things that are going on because you already have that base level of context of living in the world. But one of the major things that I love about reading nonfiction in my target language goes so far beyond just daily news and into a lot of the topics that really interest me and that I know are very unlikely to get translated into English. Now, I know that I'm not the best person to talk about learning to read in another language, but I just wanted to put this out there because I think these tips would have helped me when I was starting out figuring out reading in another language, and I am going to be using a lot of these tips in learning to read in my attempted third language. And I think it probably is an ongoing conversation to be had, where, I don't know, I might refine this video in future at some point, but I just wanted to put it out there in case it was helpful for anyone. And if you wanted a video about specific tools that have helped me in the past, I'm a little reluctant to make that kind of thing because, again, I think it's more about concepts and techniques than it is specific programs and things like that and products. But if you wanted a video like that, let me know. Or if you might be interested in a video about how I find French books that interest me, or French publishers that produce the kinds of books that interest me, let me know. I might do that anyway, but yeah, I don't know. That's all for now, and I'll see you next time. Bye!